welcome everyone to our conversation, and I'll introduce myself. I'm Katie Treadwell, she, her pronouns. I'm the Director of Student Conduct and Community Standards at the University of Kansas. Happen to be serving as the chair for NASPA's Campus Safety and Violence Prevention Knowledge Community. And Andrew, I'll ask you to introduce yourself.
Sure, thanks, Katie. I'm Andrew Foster. I'm the Emergency Management Coordinator for the University of Kansas. And I've been with KU for about 5 years, but over the last year and a half or so, I've been working directly on the pandemic response on behalf of KU leadership and management processes.
And so I'll do a quick plug at the beginning to let people know that this video series is just meant to collect stories and information and perspectives on campus safety and violence prevention. And so if people who are watching want to talk with someone on their campus about what that work looks like, we'd love to have that connection as well. But Andrew, before we jump in, tell us a little bit about your background and what brought you to this work and to KU specifically.
Yeah, so I always say I got lost and found myself here somehow. I'm a Kansas kid. I grew up in the Wichita area. I joined the Navy when I was 17 and went off, and that was pre 9/11. So I did all of the 9/11 response. And then, the wars afterwards, we deployed a bunch of, are you still there? You locked up for a second.
I am, and the nature of working from home is can happen, and that's okay.
Okay.
So go ahead, Andrew.
Oh no, I was just saying. So I spent some time in the Navy, and then after I got out of the Navy, I came back to KU for school. And I did my degree at KU, and then I went to work for the state of Kansas after I got my degree, doing emergency management for the state of Kansas, primarily on continuity of operations, continuity of government, and emergency operations for state and local governments. Spent about 5 years doing that, and then I came over to KU as the emergency manager, and have been in that role for about 5-6 years. I don't know, how long has the pandemic been going now? So 6 years. Yeah.
8 or 9 years. Yeah.
9 years. So I took over as emergency manager here and have served in quite a variety of fashions within that role as part of public safety.
So pandemic aside, and I don't know if we can put pandemic aside at this point, but prior to the pandemic, what did your kind of normal work life look like, your responsibilities? How are you spending your time in emergency management?
Yeah, so emergency management spends most of its time doing training on incident command systems, emergency response procedures, everything that you would think of that goes into threats, acts of violence training, tornado training here in the Midwest. On the coast, you might see hurricane training or earthquake training, all of those like natural disaster type stuff. We're also heavily involved in the disaster recovery through information technology services. So that's a common thing that you'll find emergency management in. So anything that can go wrong, we help train people on what that threat might be and then how an institution or an organization within the institution would respond. We're also the general conduit typically between state and local government and a university or an institution of education. And so we liaison with all of those groups pretty effectively. The other part of it is that once we do all the training, we need to spend as much time possible exercising that training. So we do drills and exercises and try to put people through the paces and see that if the training that we've given was effective and they now know how to respond, or if we need to fix something and make it different or change our processes so that they're more effective. Over the last 10 years or so, most people have really focused on emergency management training related to the acts of violence. That's the thing that's been the really hot topic item that everybody's focused on over years. But there's a ton of disasters that strike a campus every day. Water main breaks and power outages and these things that can harm critical research or individuals, of course, on campus. And so we try to be as broad spectrum as possible to make sure that we protect everybody within the whole community as much as possible.
So I think the last tabletop exercise that you and I did together pre-pandemic was training around cyber attacks, and was just incredibly valuable. And I know a lot of people learned a lot to talk about tabletop drills and those drills more generally, sort of how you approach those, who you involve, the value of that to some extent, and maybe for people who aren't doing that right now, sort of tips or thoughts about how to start that effort.
Yeah, absolutely. And I can send you a link. I don't know if it's possible to share it
Yeah,
through the interwebs here, but I can send you a link to
absolutely.
how people can, get involved in exercises at their institutions. But there's all kinds of different levels. So when you do like a fire drill, that's an exercise where you're putting people through the paces. They're testing their ability to get out of a building if it's on fire. And that may sound dumb to a lot of people because everybody knows how to get out of a building. But we did a fire drill in a building, and there was a bunch of international students that were in there, and they didn't know that the alarm meant that the building was on fire. So it wasn't until we told them that that meant the building was on fire that they understood that they needed to leave. So even the most menial of drills to us might be really important for somebody else who hasn't experienced that. As you move up the chain and get more advanced in exercises, you get into things like a tabletop exercise. This is something where everybody goes to a large room. We do them virtually now as well, but traditionally we would all go to a large room. And this would be everybody from your, provost or chancellor, president, or, however your organizational structure is set up. We would invite all of the leadership team, and then you would also have the people that would normally be involved in the decision making or participating in that type of environment. So IT, when we did that one, it was a real information technology heavy group, but we also had people from our student affairs body, because if IT goes down, then student affairs is involved because students can't access a lot of their resources. And a ton of other folks that would be in there. We put them all into a room, and then I give them a scenario that, this X bad thing happened, and how do you respond? And then you escalate the scenario over a couple hours, or an hour to hour and a half, and then see how people respond as the scenario gets worse. And then you evaluate that response, and then you make corrections so that the next time that you do it, they're better at it. And this isn't something you do just once. This is something you do every year on a regular schedule, and you change the scenario every time, and people just they get better at responding to bad things, so that when something actually happens, because it will happen, it's not a matter of if something bad will happen. Things will happen in a large institution. It's just a matter of how you respond to it and how you recover. And of course, the last type of exercise is when you do the full scale one, which is what you see with the guys running around in hazmat suits, and they're doing all the stuff where they're actually moving people around in a parking lot or in a building, practicing the physical movements. Those take a ton of work and planning, but they're really effective. And usually first responders are the ones that are most involved in that. So you'll see a lot of fire, law enforcement, and those folks involved in it.
Got it. And yes, any resources that you have that you think would be helpful, you're welcome to share. I know I've experienced different drills and exercises kind of in different levels based on institution type and things like that. And it's always interesting, I think, to see how different institutions handle that and examples. And so we're happy to pass those along.
Yeah, I'll send you
So,
that. But
yeah,
I would always say, though, if people are interested today and they don't have info at their fingertips, what they can do is reach out to their county emergency management agency and just tell them that they're interested in doing this. If they don't have a university emergency manager, they can always go to the county, and the county will give them the resources they need or help them get set up. That's been my
perfect.
experience, is that they're fantastic. Usually at almost every county has an emergency manager.
That's great. Thanks, Andrew. So switching gears to what your life has been like the last 15 months or so. I know that I think most people, when they talk about the pandemic, sort of point to that day in March when everything shut down. And where were they? And sort of overnight, we just all went home. And I think a lot of people across the country had that experience. And I think you were experiencing things earlier than that March day when everything shut down. So talk to us about sort of your lead up to that March day and what that initial evaluation of the pandemic or possible pandemic was like for you.
Yeah, it all happened pretty quick, and most institutions, you're right, kind of got together a little bit later. When I worked for the state, I did quite a bit of for the state of Kansas. I did some pandemic planning. That was one of my roles, and so I had a pretty good idea of what pandemics might look like if it happened. We did a lot of foreign animal disease planning, and so I had this really apocalyptic view in my mind. And as soon as I heard what was happening in China, I understood that this was going to be a big deal and the gravity was going to be pretty substantial. And so early January, we placed our first PPE order before anything else had happened. We started doing an accounting of what we had on hand, like January 15th or 19th, and went into full scale plans for that. And that was when I started telling everybody that like we need to get our head around it. And then we had our first suspected case in mid-February where we thought somebody had traveled from abroad and we thought maybe we had an issue. And so it was weird to see how everyone responded. And then it was early March that everyone was being told not to return after spring break. And so it all showed up really fast, but it was something that we actually did and do have a pandemic plan for the university. We developed one. That was one of the first things that I did when I got to KU was to build a pandemic response plan, because even though they don't happen very often, we knew that if it did happen, it would be the most disruptive thing. And what I realized in looking back at that plan now is I produced an epidemic response plan, not a pandemic response plan. We didn't plan big enough, and I don't think anybody really did. If we had a measles or mumps outbreak, we were great, but if every available resource in the world was taken, you just can't plan. I mean, it was impossible to think that big, I guess. So it all got going pretty quick, and then we just kind of sustained where we were at with everything. But we were fortunate to have a pretty good footing and to get ahead of the game just a little bit to get some of those resources in that we needed.
Absolutely. And it's so interesting to think about that difference between an epidemic plan and a pandemic plan. I remember, some of my research working with leaders at institutions after Hurricane Katrina. They talked about how important it was to have a plan, and that plan was only good for 3 or 4 days, and then the situation just changed so much that the plan just really wasn't effective anymore. And so that's interesting to think sort of about the scale.
So a lot of times when I do planning, like even with all disasters, right? So this group that we're talking here today deals with, not just pandemic but with all types of like campus safety and violence and all of that stuff, right?
Yes.
So like when you're talking about this, there's the two distinct phases of a disaster. There's multiple phases, but the two big ones are the response phase of the disaster, which is what happens immediately after the bad thing happens. And then there's the recovery phase, which is the thing that lasts for the next year to 2 years or 3 years, depending on the size of the event. And your response is almost always the easy part. The pandemic's been a little more challenging, but if there's like an act of violence, the response is the easier part because it only lasts a few minutes typically. If it's a tornado, it only lasts a few minutes. The recovery is the really hard part. And so I always put as much energy into the recovery part as possible, because no matter what the disaster is and how quickly it changes from the recovery side, and you do throw the plan away at some point after a couple days because you just couldn't plan everything that's going to happen, that elements of recovery are consistent. You're going to have to do certain things. You're going to have to help people. You're going to have to help get people back to normal in some way. You're going to have to support, mental health issues, physical health issues, all of those things that go into a community recovery. And those are consistent amongst almost every disaster that you look at. And so focusing on those recovery aspects is just as critical, even though it doesn't have the glory of what a response looks like. I mean, everybody sees the pictures of a response and nobody sees the people struggling through a recovery for years and years trying to figure stuff out.
And I think I really appreciate you saying that, Andrew. I think that's where, in my research and my experience doing this work, so many institutions or pockets within institutions miss the mark, is that we all have these really detailed response plans. And it's harder in some ways to advocate for why we need just as detailed or more detailed recovery plans. How do you sort of, within an emergency management space, you're situated in KU Police and the broader institution, how have you advocated for those recovery pieces, and how are you doing that with pandemic right now?
Yeah, so I start advocating for recovery on day one of the disaster. The first thing that you should always plan for in a disaster is trying to get out of that disaster and then fixing everything that's bad. Not really fixing it so that it goes back to normal, but fixing it so that it goes back to better than it was before. There's no point in putting everything back exactly how it was, right? Otherwise, you're putting it back into a vulnerable state. Why don't we put it back into a state that we've learned from our disaster so that things are now improved as we move forward? So I've always looked at that, and I look at from a human approach, right? How has this affected people, and what do we do to improve the lives of those individuals within our community through this recovery process as we go forward? And so you can pretty easily look at the pandemic and see where people have been affected. There's social change, there's economic issues that you've seen within individuals, or within individual groups, there's all kinds of stuff that is deeply affected the student and the human experience at a university. And you can take a look at that and say, these are the areas that we need to focus on for recovery and make sure that we don't leave anybody behind. You fill all those gaps and you make sure that no individual or group of individuals based on any kind of class gets left behind, either intentionally or by accident. And if you focus on all those things, which I know like student affairs leaders are always great because there's such a broad spectrum within the student population, that most of my recovery objectives tend to fall in with a student group of some sort. The only ones that don't are going to be your faculty and staff groups for your employment classes that you're trying to do recovery objectives on, or operational university objectives. But 90% of recovery at an institution is going to be within the student population. So, and that's why we know each other so well, right?
Right.
Because we've talked over the years
So
about
well.
these type of things.
Yes. So your life, I think the last 15 months has been total chaos is maybe too much, but unexpected to say the least. And I think a lot of people have had the luxury of being able to work remotely and enjoy wearing their sweatpants and a little bit more comfortable work environment. And certainly a lot of people have not had that opportunity. What has your daily life been like, or the last 15 months of work, and Andrew, and how you are still a functioning human right now?
Yeah, it's been challenging, like um, I it's just been challenging across the board. So like my days are calming down a hair now because we're getting towards, closer towards the end. But in the hard phase of it, when we were, the first couple months through, like the first year basically, was super challenging. And so a lot of those days were, 12, 15-hour days, sitting in a room in front of a computer. I'm fortunate, better than a lot of folks, that I have a comfortable space. I have a comfortable room. I have, an office that I can sit in. Not everybody was as fortunate as that. There was a lot of people having these same meetings that I were, and they're sitting on the edge of their bed. And so I feel fortunate in a lot of ways. But the strain has been real, right? So like we don't talk enough about how vulnerable people have been during this time. And the strain has definitely been real. And I've struggled, and I've seen my friends and my colleagues struggle, mentally and physically, for not moving around and for having to deal with these issues. Because every decision that we've had to make directly impacts somebody's life, right? It impacts their livelihood, it impacts their ability to get an education, it impacts everything. Like, so whenever an organization makes these big changes, it's a big deal, and we take that to heart. Like, every time you have to do something that somebody's not going to have as good of an outcome, but it's the safe thing, it's really difficult. And so that weighs on you time and time again, and you just really struggle after a while. So I think 15 months into this, I think we all feel that strain. I know I do. I feel a lot of pressure and a lot of strain over time. And I'm looking forward to getting deeper into recovery, where we can start to transfer some of those responsibilities other to people that maybe are better suited to deal with the direct contact and the direct interactions with the individuals, to give a better outcome so that they can be more successful in the recovery process. It's been really centrally organized, and I'd like that to be a little more decentralized to the experts.
Yeah. When we just were getting set up for this conversation, you shared that you initially and immediately knew that this was going to be a long
Mhm.
effort. On that March day when everything shut down, I was actually in London with a group of KU students on a study abroad program. And
Okay.
I knew that I was going to have to quarantine before I knew the university was going remote. And I remember feeling so guilty that I was not going to be in the office for 2 weeks. And of course, I just had no idea 15 months later what that experience would be like. And you knew, what sort of informed that knowledge that this was going to be a long process, and where do you see us shifting towards that recovery space?
Yeah, I honestly remember seeing the list of people. So we kept a list, or still do, of all KU folks that were abroad, so that if there was an emergency, we can, figure out how to get them home. And I remember seeing your name on that list and being like, "Oh no," because we knew that it was bad, but we didn't know how rapidly or how fast it was spreading, and we didn't know the long-term impacts. And so there was a lot of questions about whether our folks abroad were safe. Um, I think just my experience with other pandemic planning and looking, historically at other pandemics and other like foreign animal disease outbreaks and things like that, you see that there's this like, I don't know, 15 to 20 month window, or 18 to 24 months, depending on which one you're looking at or how it plays out. And so as I saw the spread in China, and then as it quickly spread it more broadly, it became pretty evident that we were going to be in this for the long haul. And so it was just a matter of bracing ourselves, get settled in, figure out what we have to do, figure out what we need to do to make the change as it happens, and get everyone into the right spot. There's a lot of things we could have done differently, and we're definitely going to look at that so that if we ever have another pandemic again, we can do it right. But we're going to use these lessons that we've taken from this and hopefully apply them to other disasters that as they come. But what was else? You asked something else there that I missed. Did I miss something?
No, I think you covered it. And I think that's a good transition to think about sort of the lessons learned. KU is hoping and planning to be in a more normal post-pandemic, but normal space in the fall semester. And I know we've talked a lot about what those lessons are and how do you move forward, think about other disaster planning. What does that look like for you right now?
Yeah, so we paused a lot of our training and exercise stuff. Almost all of our training and exercise was intended for people in person. And so we've done some of the training remotely, but it's just not the same because the threats aren't the same as when you have 35,000 or 40,000 people in one spot. It's just a different environment. And so we paused. Learn from you froze up there. For you back? Okay, so we're going to learn the lessons from the pandemic and the stuff that we've seen that have been successful, like Zoom, right? Like Zoom wasn't a thing 15 months ago for most people. It existed, but nobody really used it. Getting people to use it now more regularly, and to be able to provide higher levels of training and like have a more equitable approach to some individuals who might not be able to always be in person to place due to a variety of reasons. Like using these tools and using the lessons learned, we should be able to get back into a training, exercise, and preparedness model that's hopefully way more robust than what we've previously been able to do. And the other part of it is, and maybe I already said this, but like everybody's just gone through this huge disaster. Everybody just learned disaster response skills, right? Like everybody is now prepared, whether you know it or not. If you were part of this response and if you were working on this, you've learned the little response secrets. And so if something bad happens at your institution, you're already better prepared to respond than you were 15 months ago because of this pandemic, for better or worse. We don't want to let that go. We want that knowledge to stay within our leaders, right? And we want the people that are our future leaders, so our students and our junior folks at the university, to take those things, learn what's going on, learn how to make better decisions, develop leadership skills within a disaster environment, and be able to apply those skills as they move up in their positions or as they move to other institutions. It just makes sense that there's so much knowledge out there that we use it to our advantage so that we have a more resilient university, which in turn creates a more resilient community, and country, if you will, if you really expand it. So I think we can take all of these things and really build upon what we know now. And I'm hoping that we don't lose any of that.
Absolutely. And one of the things I think, and we've talked about, that a lot of institutions make the mistake of doing is having really robust plans and training for a very small group of sort of behind closed doors people and not expanding that out. And so I love what you said about sort of we all have that knowledge now, and how do we maintain that and continue to develop that? Do you have thoughts about how you expand that training and that work and make sure that people don't lose those lessons learned as we move from this?
Yeah, I definitely have thoughts about it. Everybody that's listening is probably like, man, that guy has a lot of thoughts. He can share a few less. I think part of the problem when you look at disaster response in general, and every institution to some extent has the same thing, is that there are individuals that are always going to want to like hold the power, right? And so there's this thing in disaster response where they say the first thing that should go out the door when you come in is your ego, because a disaster does not care about an ego. A tornado, a fire, a flood does not care about an ego. All it cares about is how you protect each other as you come through the door. And that's something that we see people struggle with, is that folks really want to be in the room where it happens, to quote Hamilton. Hope everybody loves my Hamilton quote. Um, but we really need more people to be knowledgeable about it. And so we need to expand that and allow us to, delegate other people within our organization to these trainings and meetings, and give more authority away as opposed to trying to possess it all ourselves. Because if the pandemic's taught me anything, it's I can't do it all by myself. I feel like I've been really successful because I've been fortunate enough to have a team that is just an amazing group of individuals who have been able to pick up all of these things that we need to get done and do those. If you try to hold that all in on your own, the stress will overwhelm you, you'll shut down and you won't be able to do it. And so you got to engage more of your staff and more people, and give people a chance to succeed or fail in a training environment. So if the real thing happens, they've already been through it and you've seen where to build on it. And something else that I have noticed is that we need to continue to build leaders. So we've built a lot of really proficient people that are really good at a lot of things, but we don't always focus on actual leadership skills, and especially leadership in a remote environment. That's a whole different type of thing to lead a group of individuals through a Zoom meeting into a stressful situation and then have a successful outcome out of it. That's something that, I wasn't really prepared to do that remotely when we first started, and we had to adjust and be adaptable to get there. And so getting those folks in there. And then lastly, I would say on that next step would be engaging students, right? So like so often in disaster response or emergency response or anything bad that's happening, the students, to include graduate students, often get left off to the side and are only just seen as the participants, but not actually seen as the people that should be involved in the process. I think if we engage students early on, it makes a lot of sense, because they're getting the training, they're getting the leadership skills, they're being a part of an actual response and protecting their organization, which then they can later be proud of, that they represented their university or college appropriately. And they know the best about their peers, and so they know how to protect their peers and reach their peers better than we do a lot of times. And so engaging students early and often, I think, has been a really critical role that I mean, that should make a lot of sense to a student affairs group of people, but it didn't make sense to everybody else early on in the pandemic. And it was a lesson that we had to learn through student affairs beating us down with it.
Andrew, I have talked to two campuses in the last week, actually, who very different institutions, very different contexts. They do not have an Andrew Foster, and there's probably a lot of campuses out there that don't have someone like you. And these campuses have reached out and said, we're thinking about creating an emergency management plan. Where should we start? And there's so much information out there. Do you have one or two sort of starting points or resources that you would point people to in that situation?
Yeah, so almost all emergency plans on the county level are under some sort of a state plan. So there's a state level emergency management plan. Through most jurisdictions in the United States, counties are required to have an emergency operations or emergency management plan. And we try to base ours off of our jurisdiction that we're within, off of their plan, so that it all kind of rolls up. Ideally, you don't want to create an emergency management plan that's standalone, that only represents your organization. You want everything to be centralized or streamlined, so that the university's response complements the county's response, which complements the state response, which complements the federal response. Because every time you run out of a resource at your institution, it rolls up to the next people. And if you don't work with them and communicate with them anyway, they're not going to know what your intent was or what you needed from them. So you might as well talk to the county emergency management and ask them, for resources on where to start. They're probably going to direct you to a ton of really good federal guidance documents on how to plan and how to make emergency plans. There's a bunch of really good documents that'll walk you right through that whole process. And it's not super complicated. And honestly, we tend to overthink it, but the first draft of a plan for an emergency plan for a university should be simple. Like, it doesn't need to cover every single thing you've ever thought of in your life. It just needs to cover the basics, and those basics can easily be outlined by almost any emergency manager that's out there, and especially a county emergency management agency. If you don't have one at your institution, will help you get set up and on the right path.
Great. So I believe, especially after this, that that you know the future and all the things that are coming, in part because I think you were so ahead of the game with at least having an initial pandemic plan and being involved in ordering PPE in January and things like that. As we hopefully move to some sort of post pandemic and we're thinking about maybe the worst of this is behind us, are there other uh, issues, concerns, specific types of disasters that are on your horizon that you would suggest in particular people need to be focused on planning for right now?
Um, everything, right? So
All the things.
all the things. You know, the big thing that has, and this will be pretty applicable, I think, to the student affairs body. My big concern is that as we're getting out of this pandemic, we've got people that have been isolated for 15 months. We've got high school students that lost their senior year that didn't really get that experience, and we've got college students that have been isolated. There's going to be a ton of anxiety. There's going to be a lot of mental health issues. There's going to be a lot of stuff that people need to really get addressed. Like, I mean, they need assistance with, right? Because where else are you going to get it when you're locked in your house with maybe your parents or maybe nobody for a year to year and a half? It just builds and it builds and it builds. And so I just really worry that those mental health issues are going to be our next real crisis that we see. Is that people are going to look for outlets. And when you look for outlets, there's only bad things that can happen if you can't find someone to professionally assist you with getting the help that you need. And so I think that the next year to year and a half as we get out of this, that's going to be our big crisis that we look at, is that there'll be a need more assistance than we're able to provide. I really do. I mean, that's the biggest thing that I worry about every day. And that's, before I got on this call with you today, I was talking with somebody else about the exact same thing, that we need to reintegrate into society and learn how to be around people and learn how to protect ourselves again and fix the bad things that we did to ourselves while we were locked up, and learn how to love again, like love strangers again. That's all stuff that I think student affairs does really well. And so I'm hopeful that campuses will be smart enough to engage their student affairs professionals, and let them lead the way to really show how to get back to normal for a lot of folks.
Yeah. I really appreciate that, Andrew, and I think you're so right. And those of us who serve on care teams or threat assessment teams or behavior intervention teams, whatever it's called on a particular campus, have seen those increased report numbers and concerns coming through on a daily basis, and know that that will continue for quite some time. And so that's certainly something this group can work on, providing some resources and information. And I'm glad to hear that people who do emergency management work are also focused on that and looking at how do we, just as campuses, holistically address that and provide support and redirect resources when we can. I think that's just so critical. So I'm glad you're thinking about that too. I trust that it will happen and happen well.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, from the data that if somebody doesn't show up on a student affairs radar at some point and they have those issues, they show up on someone else's radar, whether it's, fire and medical, or whether it's law enforcement or somebody else. They're going to show up, they're going to pop somewhere. It's best that they get the help that they need before they show up in a bad situation. And so if student affairs folks out there aren't already advocating to their campus to expand those services, I would strongly recommend that they start that, because there'll be a lot of people that, a lot of institutions and a lot of leaders that don't realize that that's going to be an issue until it's too late, and hopefully we can avoid that if at all possible.
And I think that also speaks to the importance of working collaboratively across your institution or across your city or county or whatever the situation is, so that those relationships between law enforcement and student affairs and mental health services are there. And so I appreciate you sharing that as well.
Yeah.
Andrew, those are my questions for you. Any final thoughts, things I haven't asked, things that people definitely need to know?
There always thoughts, always things people to know, but no, I think good questions, and I hope that my answers are helpful. I know that we've got a lot of stuff going on. It's been a long year and a half. It's been a long couple of years in the coming, I think, and then the next couple of years are going to be just as difficult in a lot of different ways. Every institution is going to struggle with financial changes and student behavior changes and all of this stuff that makes it more difficult to do your job. And I try to remind myself on a regular basis that what we need to do is continue to remember that we exist so that we can get students educated and that we can make them into leaders so that we have a more successful future for our communities. And so, I appreciate the time to talk, and I hope that the information I shared is helpful. If there's some way that I can continue to provide information, I'm happy to do that. I know I'll get you some links and stuff, but
That's great.
hopefully there's a way forward to assist in any way I can.
Well, we will definitely call on you and connect people to you. And I think that's a great note to end on, the focus that we exist for student learning, and the emergency management and disaster planning is unfortunately part of the work, but trying to stay focused on how do we educate students and help them live their best lives and um, do that work together. So I appreciate it. So thank you, Andrew, for your time and energy and work the last really 18 months at this point, and for still being human and standing and functioning and talking with us today.
Happy to do it.
Yeah.